My pleasure to introduce today our next session of the TREATS Talks, Translational Research Ethics Applied Topics, which are meant to be short introductions for non-specialists, although sometimes we get pretty abstract. And I'm guessing Jane, Professor Hartsock might get into the weeds as well. But we try to make this an introduction to an important topic in ethics for everybody. It's supposed to be like about 30 minutes of talking, although sometimes we go long, and then discussion. And these are all shared stored on our website for later consumption and reference. And also the bioethics program of CTSI is always available to help you with consultations. We do sometimes get consultations on authorship. Today's speaker is Jane Hartsock, who is a longtime member of the Center for Bioethics and the bioethics program of CTSI. Her day job is System Director of Clinical and Organizational Ethics at IU Health in the Fairbanks Center for Medical Ethics. She co-chairs the Ethics Consultation Subcommittee there, and she is Adjunct Assistant Professor of Medical Humanities and Health Studies at IUI, as well as, again, like I mentioned, a absolute stalwart member, a faculty investigator at the IU Center for Bioethics. And she'll be speaking to us today about authorship in this new age of AI. And with no further ado and no further discussion of people's pets, I hand it off to Professor Hartsock.
All right, well, thank you. I'm actually happy to discuss my pet. I have Sammy, an Irish Terrier who is spirited. I'm going to share my screen, and I tested this beforehand, so it is guaranteed now not to work. So let's see if we can get it to, here we go. I do only have one screen open, so I think it's possible that there be like the gray out box on the side here, but I'll try to make this all work. Okay, so this is me. And what we are going to do today, as Peter said, is discuss some of the ethics of authorship and the constraints on authorship and the issues in authorship now that we are firmly in the world of artificial intelligence and large language models. So our objectives for today are to define some relevant terminology, to review the guidelines, the traditional guidelines for author status, and then to provide some practical guidance for writing in the age of AI. And as part of that, I will make some predictions or hopefully provoke some conversation as it pertains to what may be coming down the pike, because obviously we're quite young in this conversation. So we'll begin by defining artificial intelligence broadly. So this is the definition. Oh, and I should say, I really am going to try to stick really closely to like 20 to 30 minutes, because I think that, at least for the TREATS talks, that the discussion or the questions afterwards are really where a lot of the meat of the lecture ends up being. So just by way of background, the definition for artificial intelligence that I adhere to is the one in the US Code and as articulated by the Turing Institute. So the science of making computers do things that require intelligence when done by humans. And I like this definition because it does draw a very clear distinction between the human and the machine. And then the US Code defines artificial intelligence as a machine-based system that can, for a given set of human-defined objectives, make predictions, recommendations, or decisions influencing real or virtual environments. I like that definition a little bit less, but we'll use it because it is the one being used. Artificial intelligence obviously is a broad category under which a number of different technologies exist. And one of them is going to be the focus of our discussion today. So what we're really going to be talking about today are large language models. So for those of you, obviously, who are already well-schooled in this discussion, AI does a whole lot of things. I actually just read yesterday about some of the work that's being done at Harvard to develop a diagnosis bot. It can diagnose as well as a human physician in about the amount of time it takes to make a cup of coffee. So that was some interesting news yesterday. But as I said, we're going to focus on writing, particularly scholarly writing. So what we're really focused on are large language models. An LLM is a type of artificial intelligence that has been trained on massive amounts of text data to, quote, understand, I guess I will use that term broadly, generate and respond to human language in a coherent, human-like way. So that's the kind of definition that we're using for LLMs. Just by way of some additional background, the last estimate that I read on the LLM training is that ChatGPT, just that bot, had been trained on the equivalent of about 3.7 billion with a B pages of writing, or 300 billion words. And it has done that almost entirely without the consent or compensation of authors who often hold copyrights on that material. And that will have some consequences or potential consequences that we'll discuss a little bit further in the lecture. So as we further drill down into the focus of this lecture, we're going to be talking about some authorship norms. So how do we usually think about what it means to be an author, and how does AI change that a little bit? And then what are the sort of copyright constraints that are just beginning to emerge as particularly the concept of fair use is tested within the world of LLMs. All right, so what I've pulled up here is the traditional definition of what constitutes an author under the ICMJE, which is the most common articulation of authorship that's required for submission of scholarly or peer-reviewed material to academic journals. And this has existed, I don't even know for how long, quite a while. You'll note that the articulation of this is an inclusive set of requirements. So substantial contribution to the conception or design of the work, or acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data, and drafting the work or revising it, and final approval of the version to be published, and an agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work. And so the idea behind this is that to call yourself an author, you must have done all four of these things. So we know that for time immemorial, right, there have been controversies that have existed within this framework well before AI sort of came on the scene in any real way. So there have always been issues, particularly as it relates to who did the data analysis and who did the lion's share of the writing, that has caused sort of controversies among people, right? Usually people authors within this framework. And there's I do a lecture for the RCR course on that in a sort of larger context. But there's no shortage of controversy with this articulation. But there is a way of thinking about this as a confusion, a point of confusion now that we have LLMs on the scene. So if you think about the different ways that people are using LLMs to produce manuscripts, and we'll talk a little bit about some of that later. There's really no point in the writing process at which people aren't bringing in an LLM. So I'm sorry, there's a lot of noise in the background of my office today. We're having quite a day here. But
I'll reassure you, Jane, we are not hearing it. So
okay, good. It's making me nervous. All right, so people will use an LLM even for the idea generation of the article, right? So the very beginning stages of writing, I want to say something about brain death in organ donation. What are some topics I might consider writing about, right? Like even just that very sort of early stage. People then use it for research on that topic. Who are the seminal authors in this space that I'm writing about? What is the latest high impact journal paper? Right, that kind of stuff. People are organizing their research through the LLM. People are using it to draft, particularly what we think of as kind of like the low return, low ROI parts of the paper, the methods section, right? Like what is the methods section here? They're also using it for data analysis. Am I leaving anything out that I should be saying in this section based on this data? Should I be pointing out any result that I've missed, that kind of thing? And then really for generation of the paper itself, people are using LLMs. So like write this paper, with these headings, with this section, and then maybe going back and kind of tweaking things. And then of course, people are using it to varying degrees on that spectrum. So, writing a paper and then asking ChatGPT or Claude to revise the paper in a way that makes it sound better, right? The language usage is better or something along those lines. So one of the ways that this sort of interacts with what we think of as authorship norms is the question of at what point the LLM steps into the role of an actual author, and you, as the person behind the screen, can no longer claim to have made a substantial contribution to the conception or design of the work, can no longer claim to have drafted the work or revised it critically for important intellectual content. And the conflict that exists here, just purely from an ethics perspective, is that ChatGPT and Claude and these other LLMs cannot accept final approval of a version published and cannot be accountable for all aspects of the work. So what happens here is a kind of dichotomy then, or a kind of a bifurcation of the responsibilities of the authorship, where the entity that has created the document cannot be responsible for the content that is put out into the world in that document. And this is a really sort of sea change kind of situation. So, for example, we saw during COVID an enormous amount of dis and misinformation published. We saw a huge number of articles being retracted, even in scholarly journals and that kind of thing. So the stakes are rather high for having an entity pushing out content that cannot be held responsible for it. Like they can't. There's no authorship misconduct, right, for ChatGPT. The reason that I'm pointing this out is because a lot of the conversation then around this topic of authorship has treated this particular conflict in a kind of blasé manner. And the phrase that I have just continually heard from a number of different places is that AI is just a new tool. The rules haven't really changed. And I think that's a little bit naive to be sort of addressing things that way. My position on this is that AI may or may not be a new tool, but there really aren't established rules yet to define this. So to walk through a little bit of the way individual journals are managing this particular age of writing, I'm going to show you the three publishers and their way of handling AI. So this is Springer Journal's AI policy. And I would describe this as being relatively restrictive. They're very, very clear that a large language model such as ChatGPT does not satisfy authorship criteria. So the use of it has to be really clearly documented. And the line of demarcation for a lot of these journals, and then for a lot of copyright law that we'll talk about in a minute, seems to fall along the difference between generating content and using AI to assist in existing content. And that line has not yet been tested in any administrative or civil court systems. So there's not really very clear line in the sand as to what constitutes what. But this is the Springer Journal sort of restrictive use of AI. So using it for editing purposes is fine. Using it to generate an entire article may not be. This is Sage, which seems to be a little bit more permissive. Welcomes developments, enhancing opportunities for generating ideas, accelerating research discovery, synthesizing, analyzing, polishing language, structuring a submission. I just want to note how much of that really is the process of writing. That what they're really saying here, if you break this down, is that you can have AI write your paper. Generating the idea, I always think of, this might be a little bit snotty of me or something like that. But I mean, like if you're really needing AI to help you generate the idea within your discipline, like you kind of aren't able to get off the starting block with that. And I wonder whether allowing for the generation even of the idea for a paper, or the idea for a project, that kind of thing is perhaps not great. But anyway, this is Sage's policy. And then I don't know if you guys can see this. Let me see if I can move the box. Um, Taylor and Francis has their own policy, which allows for idea generation, idea exploration, language improvement, that sort of thing. So the thing that's important to understand here is that each publisher is managing this in a slightly different way. So that means if you're relying really heavily on AI at the front end of writing your paper, you might lock yourself in to a specific journal or set of journals on the back end. And it's really important then for all of the authors to decide together what they're going to do with AI, how much of it they're going to use. It needs to be a very transparent process among the authors where it's discussed explicitly and everybody knows kind of what everybody's doing in their use of AI, because you will be required to disclose exactly how you used AI, irrespective of which journal you're publishing in. And the rules will be different depending on the publisher of that journal. And so the phrase that that I kind of have been using, sort of, joking around, is like, you can't un-AI your paper, right? So once you've drafted a manuscript where you've relied really, really heavily on the use of AI, say you really have had the paper generate parts of the content using AI, you might find yourself in a situation where you were targeting a specific journal, say in Sage, that had a relatively permissive AI policy. That journal does not accept your paper. And so now you're looking at other journals and you find yourself with a different publisher and you can't submit there because that publisher's AI policy is more restrictive than the Sage publishers. And you're done, right, at that point, in terms of it's not like you can tweak it back and pull the AI out. This requires, our writing process these days requires much more transparency among co-authors and much more deliberateness in thinking about exactly how you're using AI. And then in addition to that, tracking how you're using it so that you can disclose it later. So are you using it for idea generation, or is your co-author? Are you using it for research and organization of your research, or is your co-author? Those kinds of things need to be tracked and disclosed to co-authors, because they'll need to be disclosed to the journal. So one thing that authors seem to be using AI for quite a bit is research. And every publisher that I'm aware of allows the use of AI to conduct research, either to locate articles, to identify keywords or search terms, to think of strategies for conducting the research itself. And all of those journals operating with the ICMJE framework that we talked about previously do require authors to be accountable for the inaccuracies in their published works, right? So right now, LLMs are still pretty inaccurate. And I have some examples that I've pulled from, a couple of these are actually from this week that I pulled for in anticipation of this discussion. But this is one of my favorite ones that I just like for personal reasons because it's hilarious. The Google answer for the average salary for an adjunct professor is $140,000 according to the AI Google. And I apparently do need to have a very serious conversation with the School of Liberal Arts, because I am not making this and I am quite perturbed. So, it's not very accurate. Some other examples of this, though, just as you think about doing research. So one of the ways that AI can speed up research is to ask it to summarize either an entire body of research or a particular paper. And AI is pretty bad at that too. So this is from yesterday. I pulled this up just yesterday. So I asked AI to provide a 3-paragraph summary of Zora Neale Hurston's essay, My Most Humiliating Jim Crow Experience. I don't know how many of you have read this. Jane certainly has, my fellow Jane. And it sets the story in the Jim Crow South on a train and creates the conflict in the space of a quote colored car. Just for those of you who have not read this story takes place in New York City in a doctor's clinic. And the point of tension is that the physician treats Zora Neale Hurston quite poorly because she is Black. So the summary of this story is wildly inaccurate as of yesterday. So if you were going to say, for example, write a paper about representations of Black experiences at doctors' offices in at the early 20th century, and asked it to summarize this story, what it would tell you would be wrong, and then you look quite foolish when you published it. Just another really easy example of this. This was an assignment I gave my students a couple weeks ago. To write a text-to-text connection using the novel Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, which was written in 2022, and an essay, Human Paradox, the Nazi Legacy of Pernkopf's Alice. So the prompt returns an answer about Sabine Hildebrandt's essay, Human Paradox, and I can just disclose to you that Sabine Hildebrandt did not write that essay. My colleague Emily Beckman and I did. So the authorship is misattributed in this. So all of this just to say that right now AI is not very good at this. And so using it to summarize your research in a situation in which you're accountable for the consequences of that is risky, at least something to be aware of. We're also becoming increasingly aware of the incredible bias that exists within LLMs and within AI in ways that we maybe wouldn't even be aware of. So asking AI, for example, to interpret your results or to provide points of consideration in a discussion section of an article based on data may very well produce a biased result. So this is an article that came out, when was this, like 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, something like that. Asking AI for salary negotiation advice. If you identify as a woman, it will counsel you to negotiate at a lower salary than if you identify yourself as a man in the same prompt, where the only variable is the prompt identifying whether it's a man or a woman asking for the salary advice. So the point of all of this is really just a way of, is a warning to be very, very careful in relying too heavily on AI to do your research, interpret your research, summarize your research, or point you towards research, because at present, it's quite bad. The promises, of course, and I have been attending a number of these kinds of symposiums and panels and talking to people, and what I generally hear is, well, it's going to get better. It's going to eventually get better. And I actually don't think it is. I think there's an equally plausible scenario in which it gets worse. And I'll walk you through a little bit of how that might be, specifically as it interacts with copyright law. So this is the current authorship requirement by the United States Copyright Office. And so it requires that the author be a human, that the author has to produce something that is new, and it has to create it. And that is what allows copyright to attach. A human creates something new. That's sort of like your sort of broad concept of that. This has been recently reaffirmed. I know that the Trump administration has been much friendlier to artificial intelligence than perhaps the Biden administration was, although I don't know that there's a whole lot of daylight between the two administrations, but on that issue. But the general feeling, even under the Trump administration's copyright office, is that you still have to be a human and you still have to create something that was new in order to have copyright attached. So copyright will not attach to something that is generated by a machine. So this is January of 2025 that the Trump administration published part 2 of the Copyright and Artificial Intelligence Guidance. So the way this all kind of plays out is a sort of cycle of or a predicted cycle of what kind of information, what kind of data or text LLMs will be learning from going forward. So these are some of, not all of, but some of the current lawsuits involving artificial intelligence. And the ones that I've listed here are only the ones that involve the large language models or the use of language specifically. So scraping um, to um, to uh, get for the machine to learn on, so that it can generate text. The scraping process is what has been the controversial part of this on the back end of the technology. So a number of individual authors, newspapers, media sources have alleged and sued, brought cases alleging that scraping, that process of scraping, does not fall within the fair use exception of copyright laws and is a copyright violation. To use the material in that way is a copyright violation. So these are cases that are issues of first impression. That means that there's not a whole body of law that examines, for example, fair use within the concept of scraping for purposes of AI. So all of this stuff is still being sort of sorted out. It's still being resolved. Definitions are being sort of evaluated. The earliest sort of sign that we've gotten of the direction that things are kind of headed in was this enormous settlement a couple of weeks ago by Anthropic, which I believe owns Claude. They agreed to pay in a settlement $1.5 billion to a class action group of book authors. And I'm going to explain a little bit of how this took place, because the case itself seemed to initially be going poorly for those who were arguing that scraping violated copyright. So the trial court in this case agreed with Anthropic that scraping itself doesn't violate copyright. And the author community was very, very concerned about that, and took that as an indication that things were going to be really, really bad as for authors as this all sort of got sorted out. However, that trial court also held that in order to scrape the material, the company that owns the AI has to have purchased the material. They have to own it. So the way that kind of, you know, fleshed out in this case was that Anthropic had scraped from pirating websites to get unauthorized digital copies of books and articles and material. And they'd used a website called Library Genesis and then another website called Pirate Library Mirror in order to get access to those documents to scrape for their large language model. Then, as a result of that, authors who believed that their work was contained within those pirated websites could seek to be part of this settlement with Anthropic. So the trial court held that legitimately acquired content could be scraped, but not essentially stolen content that could not be scraped. The result of this has been a little bit of a flurry then within the AI ownership, the AI corporate community, because a lot of the material that they have has been stolen, essentially has been pirated from these websites. And so sorting out, like untraining the AI on from the material that has been scraped from Library Genesis, for example, is going to be nearly impossible, which I think is why Anthropic agreed to settle this rather than moving through an appellate process with this case, which would have resulted in there being actual definitive precedent on what constitutes copyright violation and what doesn't. So what happens in a trial court is not precedent for the whole country. What happens at the Supreme Court is. And so by settling this case, Anthropic essentially sort of like ends the discussion and sort of prevents the case from continuing to move forward in a way that might hinder or hurt the AI project going forward. So what the point of all of this is just that whether AI constitutes in some way or another a copyright violation for scraping is not yet decided. Okay, so I'm going to move forward. So some places have been, both in anticipation of this issue and in response to the direction, the way the wind seemed to be blowing, have been preemptively sort of trying to manage what happens with the scraping process. So Penguin Random House, one of the largest commercial publishers in the country, one of the big five, has argued that the unlicensed use of their work is a threat to the livelihoods of people, which is not the same as saying that they think it's copyright violation, but it's a pretty pronounced statement that they don't support it. And Penguin has been reticent and has in fact refused to provide content to AI companies, even in exchange for money for them to scrape on. So Penguin Random House has taken a fairly strong stand on this. Additionally, authors are managing this on an individual level. So this is actually a friend of mine, and this is her book. And in the front of the book, with the copyright information, so like copyright this date and by this publisher or whatever, she's included what is an increasingly common limitation on use in the front of her novel, stating that the novel itself may not be used in any way to train artificial intelligence technologies. And I am seeing this kind of language with an increasing frequency in novels. So before you start to think to yourself, well, we're talking about scholarly writing here. Why are we now talking about novels? The reason that we're talking about novels is because Claude and ChatGPT have scraped and trained on novels. They're scraped and trained on anything, right? So to the extent that they are being limited in their access to that training material, the concern would be that the ability of AI companies to access the content they need to scrape in order to train their LLMs may become more constrained. And so certainly the Anthropic case suggests that it's about to get more expensive. So the result of that may be that AI simply enters into a kind of loop where the material it can easily train on is fairly low quality, non-copyrighted, and non-copyrightable. And the things that it might train on might increasingly be just things it's written itself. So this suggests to me that the product may stagnate or get worse rather than improve or become more sophisticated. Perhaps it will get really, really expensive if you want it to function well. And then we're in a situation as writers where people have sort of atrophied in their writing process and then are suddenly no longer able to access the crutch that they'd been using. So, keeping pretty close to my time, here is the upshot. It is really, really important right now in particular, because things are so uncertain and so unsettled, to make determinations about exactly how AI tech is going to be used in your paper, in your research, at the front end of that paper, and to be really transparent about it with your co-authors. You probably also want to be relatively conservative in your use of AI. Again, just because things are very uncertain right now, but also because you can't un-AI your paper. And if you find yourself not within the journal that you wanted to be published in, you might have to pivot to another journal, and you're going to be limited in your ability to pivot. And then you really want to be tracking the changing landscape of copyright, because a lot of the things that are questions right now have not been answered in any kind of authoritative way that would sort of like clarify the situation for, authors sitting in Indiana. We just have sort of little tea leaves of like, oh, it looks like it's going in this direction. Oh, they look like they're doing this thing. And so very, very important to be kind of tracking that and paying attention to it. So with that, I would say one way to resolve this is just to do the work yourself. But I am more than happy to accept questions and comments. I'm going to unshare my screen so that I can see you all and talk to you all. And that's where we are at the moment. I think I got that in 30 minutes or so, like a half an hour roughly. So happy to take questions. Thank you, Richard. The ICMJE has been in existence since 1970. I would actually probably check that. You never know whether it's accurate.
So, two questions. One, I'll ask one and then I'll defer to others. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Because I can't stand silence, apparently, even though I said I could. But what you're describing in terms of again, if you've been to these workshops, it sounds like you've been in presentation. There are a lot of workshops happening on campus here, which are actually the opposite direction of what you're recommending, right? They're saying like Sean Granis gave the AI, Regan Street Institute and CTSI are running a workshop series. Sean and then Coasley Simon gave great presentations of all the way they use AI in their research, every step you mentioned, right? I'm interested in working on this project. What are interesting questions in this area? I'm interested in these questions. What are good papers I should look at? And I'm taking from you that could be something you have to disclose and could disqualify you for publication in certain journals, even that amount without any text generation. I just wanted to confirm that with you and get your thoughts on that. Because I think from Kozali and Sean's perspective, they're like, these are great tools. They give me ideas. I then go and check them, of course. But how do you feel about that? Is that making your hair stand on end, or is it more sideways?
Those are different questions. Is it making my hair stand on end? Yes. I don't know. I mean, like the idea is the fun part, but I will say this, you definitely have to disclose it. Every single journal every single publisher I've looked at would require that you disclose idea generation. Does it disqualify you from a journal? It does not appear to. I think all three of the examples that I provided would allow for idea generation within to still allow you to qualify as an author, which is a little bit odd since the actual 4 authorship criteria seem not to allow that, and you're not allowed to list ChatGPT as an author. Increasingly, though, journals are requiring that you publicly disclose how you used AI, so then that gets published with the article. And so people might look at that, and then determine how credible you are. One of the things I'll say, this is a little bit of an aside, but I am noticing a tendency now that AI is sort of off the ground of real disciplinary drift, I'll call it, where people are kind of dabbling in conversations that they don't have any real expertise in, and they're using and deploying language that they are not familiar with and don't understand the meaning of. And people can say what they want to say, but that does then suggest a loss of credibility. I mean, it's a risk, right? To be kind of dabbling around with in those things. And I'll just leave it at that. Andrew, you have a question?
Sure, thank you. The legal arguments and insights were really helpful to me. I'm curious if I'm understanding this right, is if the copyright challenges become more prevalent or perhaps even more successful, is that going to force in some way the journals to be more restrictive rather than less restrictive? Is that where you think that might go?
So that's an interesting question, whether the journals will have to be more restrictive. I don't actually know whether they could potentially have to be, right? If a journal publishes previously copyrighted material, then the journal has violated copyright. But the real risk is that the actual products won't be very good, is what I'm kind of predicting, because the material that they'll be able to train on will be really low quality, non-copyrightable, non-copyrighted content. So that would be sort of how I'm reading that particular situation. Yeah. Did that answer your question, Andrew?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, Matt?
Yeah, thanks. And I guess I'm just wondering on, like, let's say I'm not using it really for the idea generation, but I'm kind of like I would potentially use a friend or something to take a look at a draft, give me comments, maybe even look at the final paper before I send it in somewhere. And so I guess, like, how do you feel about both the disclosure of the AI for those things, as well as even how you would handle the friend, like whether,
Yeah.
because again, sometimes it might be so much that you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to acknowledge them because they've made some really good contributions to the paper. But other times you'd be like, thanks a lot, and you wouldn't mention it at all.
Yeah. So the question of how I feel about it is a little bit different than the sort of practical guidance on how to manage it. So I don't think that there's really any ethical way to engage in the use of AI for writing. And this is a larger conversation. So I have sort of particular views about activities that are centrally human. And I think of those as any activity that falls really firmly within a creative realm. So the creation of art, dance, writing, communication, that sort of thing. And so my feeling about it is don't do that. Get a colleague to go do it. Can you do it and be publishable? Absolutely. You'll have to just disclose exactly what you did. So as the way you've described it, like, well, I just kind of give the paper to AI and have it make some comments. My sense is that you're going to have to be more specific than that. Like, what did you change? What comments did you receive back? Some of the comments from AI might be something like, you've overlooked this entire discussion area. And so then that's idea generation. I used it to polish the language is the phrase that I hear, pretty frequently within this area. So anyway, just long story short, you just have to be really, really specific about what you're disclosing. Different journals require different levels of specificity. And the more that you get into that generation rather than assistant kind of realm, the less likely you are going to be able to publish it. The other thing that I'll say, and this actually gets back a little bit to Andrew's question too, a lot of the stuff hasn't been sorted out. And so one of the questions that is still lurking out there is, at what point does your article become not copyrightable? So we've talked a lot about, like, is it a copyright violation for scraping? But the other question on the other end of it is, do you lose your copyright at some point 5 years in the future when the Supreme Court finally weighs in on all of this? And if that looks like it's going to happen, then you probably will see journals start to crack down on what exactly you can do with your article. And you may have a situation later where you wrote something, say a textbook, and it's not copyrightable. And so just some things to think about in this very early age of AI.
Thank you.
Richard.
So thanks very much for this presentation. I thought it was terrific. We're talking about one form of scholarship. And in fact, there are a number of different forms of scholarship that are worth commenting on, one of which is grant proposals.
Yes.
And Greg Sachs sent around to Ann Cottingham and me a notice that aspiring researchers are going to be limited to 6 grant proposals per year. And indirectly, this is due to how easy it is to generate a grant proposal using AI. So do you foresee restrictions beginning to appear in terms of other forms of scholarship like grant proposals? And if so, what would those look like?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I could, if that's something that sort of takes off, I could certainly see restrictions in the number of articles you can submit per year to a particular journal, maybe. Yeah, that's an interesting question to think about, the volume of material that people can now submit. Yeah, I think you're right that there might be limitations and other things. I've also thought this is something I don't know that anybody has a real appetite for, but we might want to start thinking about the way we evaluate promotion and tenure, and what counts towards those things. If people are writing 15 articles a year, but 14 of them are leaning really heavily on AI, does that count towards promotion and tenure? If people are submitting 6, 7, 8 grants a year, which ones of those count
Mhm.
if they're leaning on AI. I'm not important enough or powerful enough to really be able to tip the scales in any particular direction on that conversation. But it does seem to me like faculty are going to have something to say about that, if they see their colleagues sort of moving up the ranks and they know, for example, that that person is just churning out AI content, even as we tell our students not to, right? Like there's a certain irony there.
Yeah. So the other thing I just wanted to comment on is the question of submitting the same prompt to ChatGPT or whatever tool you're using multiple times and getting different responses each time you submit, and how to manage the drift, especially the drift toward hallucinations as you resubmit. So where do you draw the line, and how do you account for these variations?
So I don't know I mean, I think I understand your question, but I don't know that that really falls within any particular area of expertise for me. I don't lean heavily on ChatGPT, because I don't like the way it writes, and I don't think that it is very reliable in its output. It would make me nervous. My background is in law, where there are really sort of significant penalties for getting something wrong. And so I don't lean on it in that respect. But I don't have any, I mean, I think you as an author are accountable for the inaccuracies of something that you publish. And I can't imagine many people, either at a journal or among your colleagues, sort of like shrugging it off if the reason your article is retracted, for example, is because you screwed up and didn't double check AI. Um, is that kind of what you're asking about? I don't know that I have a whole lot of points of guidance on that particular question other than that.
It wasn't exactly what I was commenting on. It was more that it doesn't seem to be as stable a medium as people assume it
Oh,
to be.
I 100% agree with that. And I would just say on that point, I mean, this is not a piece of advice or a piece of guidance, but I find it enormously frustrating the way particularly my students seem inclined to believe ChatGPT, even as I am standing in front of them and saying, no, that's actually wrong. I don't make $140,000 a year adjuncting, right? Like there's some kind of imprimatur of authority that these bots have that is unearned and really dangerous. It seems like it comes with a kind of stamp of authority that when it should come with enormous skepticism, at least
Yeah.
right now. Yeah.
Well, if you annualize the $64 or $68 an hour into a full-time job, it probably would be
Yeah, maybe.
$140,000, but
Yeah, maybe.
nobody nobody does that.
All right, Andrew, you got a question too?
I don't know. Peter, were you ahead of me?
I think it shows up in the order.
Okay, so here's a situation that I'm curious about, because, and I don't know exactly how it works. This idea that when we submit, like I submitted with a couple of authors a chapter for a book, and just before it was published, we were told that it was copy edited by a large language model by the book publisher without our permission or our approval as authors. And so my colleagues, I didn't think about this particular aspect, but my colleagues mentioned, well, isn't that already basically allowing the large language model they use to scrape all that data before it's published? And then isn't that sort of getting around the copyright legality, because we've just given them all of that information as a potential training tool and without any author permissions at that point? So I'm curious what's happening there. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So, yeah, so I will say to answer your direct question, isn't that getting around the copyright? Not necessarily, right? And so here's why. Some of these products that are being sold, right, to say a publisher, to say Routledge, or I don't know if it, whatever, some publisher, some of those products have trained their LLM on some whatever material and are no longer training it on that material, right? So they sell it then to a company and they say, this is a defined product. You can have a license to use it. And then hopefully that company is then saying back, well, what are you using our data for, right? And the company might say, well, we don't use and store any of your data. We're already doing that over on this end. Right. And so it is not necessarily the case then that your chapter or your textbook is now in the sea of stuff like in OpenAI or something. That's not the case. It very well may be the case though. And so I hadn't prepared any part of this, kind of conversation, but one piece of advice might be that for those things that you are seeking to publish, particularly like a textbook or a book, like whatever it is that you're publishing, you probably do want to ask the publisher, like, how do you use AI once you have copyright, because you hand over copyright when you publish, right? So once you have copyright of this, what are you using it for? Because this is the thing that commercial authors have run into, which is that I think it's HarperCollins sold all to OpenAI its novels. And the authors were like, wait a minute, we didn't agree to that. And they were like, you don't have to, we own it. So that's a question you probably want to navigate at the front end of your process and with your publisher. It's
Oh,
worth asking these days.
Yeah, thank you. That's really great advice. Thank
Okay, Peter, you look upset.
Oh, no, just a second. Yeah, no, I was trying to find actually the Dean Hess email. I think
Oh,
it's called Dean's Corner from yesterday, describing how he did this class. Yeah, and Matt saw this email too, AI 101, and how wonderful it was, right? He developed an idea, he did a literature search, he even, I think he may have said he drafted text, and it was all in a day or a few minutes instead of hours. So again, this is fascinating, and I think the ethical reflection on the use of AI is just could not be more essential. So thank you for the talk, Jane. I think you hit a lot of this. Of course, authorship disputes are not new, as you said. Kim Quaid, my wonderful colleague, now passed, said everybody either has had a serious authorship dispute or will have one, right?
yeah.
It's always been. And authorship is an odd concept. I think it's actually it's a little primitive, right? Like the idea, like
Sure.
the author who created it. And this gets to my question, which is you disclose that you asked an AI to bounce ideas off of, but you don't disclose that you talked to Peter Schwartz. Right? You don't have to disclose my postdoc has an idea and we bounce ideas back and forth. I mean, I'm not going to be an author. Maybe he acknowledges me, maybe he doesn't. But it's fascinating that AI has to be disclosed, right? That somehow it's different than talking to a colleague. It's probably worse, but maybe better. And I don't know. It's fascinating. Like, what do you disclose? What needs and
Yeah.
I just have less of a disclosure. Just pick what you want to talk about. One, what a pathetically weak requirement. I disclose. Okay, disclose. Who cares? Right? Disclose. Who cares? Second is so don't disclose. I mean, talk about a crime that even Peter Schwartz could get away with. Just don't mention it. They're not going to track my computer and figure out that I asked chat for a lit search on ethics of AI, which I did. Yeah.
So I'll say two things on that point. First of all, Peter, I do actually, in my acknowledgments, recognize my colleagues if I have a particularly important conversation with them that yields, that's more than just a kind of like, hey, what do you think? But but the quality of conversation that I have with my colleagues, it suddenly, reaches a threshold, and I disclose it in the acknowledgments. I am of a mind that anything that is AI touched should carry essentially a kind of digital watermark that says AI produced this. And so I'm on the far end of the AI skepticism. So it does matter to me to see people disclosing how they used it, because that will affect how critically and how skeptically I read the thing that's been published. And yes, people can lie because people have always been able to lie, and AI is just a new thing for them to lie about in authorship. So I don't see that as being necessarily qualitatively different. But I think Matt had a question. Did you?
I did. I know we're almost out of time. It was kind of along that, kind of your last point. That is, in this age of collaborations and, authorship lists that are, realistically 10, 15, which is not unreasonable. how do I know that sixth author on my paper who generated, I just trust them? Like, is
You
there
trust
any
them.
way, like that watermark? That's the idea, but that doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was some talk under the Biden administration of potentially creating that, and I don't know whether that was shut down by sort of, the AI corporations, or whether that just got kind of lost in the dust with the administration changeover. But I would support AI watermarking, digital watermarking, whatever we want to call it. I think there's some concern that the result of that might be a problem because places like Russia would just not watermark their stuff, right? So you would need sort of international agreement to use something like that.
So you think best practice would just be upfront, say all authors, just to make it clear,
Yes.
we're not using AI for any part of this, and if you choose to, you need to let me know.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what I would do because I'm particularly not AI friendly, but I think really anything that's just like, okay, we're starting a paper and things are different now than they were 5 years ago. Let's reach some agreements now. Who's doing what and how are we doing it? And just because you have to, both to maintain your professional collegial relationships, because people have different attitudes towards AI, and then also because you're going to need that information when you publish it to disclose to the journal, ideally.
Well, Professor Hartsock, unless there are other questions, anybody? Jane, I can't believe you don't have a question, Jane. I know you way too well.
I do have a question, actually,
go
but
ahead.
I mean, it's late.
Jane is
you know,
thanked.
my thought,
Jane, go ahead.
my thoughts, of course, this of course strikes fear into the hearts of people who teach writing carefully and try to get undergraduates to think critically, because our instinct is that if you look to a machine to develop the thesis for this piece that you're writing about, you're not likely to succeed in developing your critical thinking. But I'm kind of curious to know, since so much of what we do when we're teaching people to write is edit their writing to try to get them to understand the process of
Yep.
revision better. I'm curious to know if anyone has written yet about this actually helping people's critical thinking, at the undergraduate level. And I realize most of what we've been talking about is, people who are working on research. We are faculty members, that kind of thing. But I think for undergraduates, particularly in a place like IUI or even graduate students, the thought of their using this in lieu of developing their own ideas about a piece of literature, say, is horrible. My poor colleagues who are still in the trenches are freaking out, and I get why. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Has anyone written about the development of critical thinking in the 20-year-old brain, and whether or not this is going to help people at all?
So nobody's written that it's going to help people. I mean, not credibly written it. There was the recent study, I think, out of MIT that it makes people dumber. And
That's
that
what I
was
worry about.
the N on that was really small. And so a lot of companies are saying, a lot of the commentary is like, well, this is not scientifically valid research, but it's the canary in the coal mine, right? Like any professor in a classroom can tell you that this is not good for students. And for people who write as a practice regularly, you're very aware of the fact that there's a cognitive process that happens there that sort of is good for you. Right. And so I guess what I'll end with here is to say that I do remain deeply concerned that that this is actually going to make people dumber.
Yeah.
And then I have a secondary labor concern, which is that people who are writers and creatives have traditionally been relatively disvalued monetarily. And they've been told that the reason for that is because you can't attach a dollar value to their work. And what we're finding is that you absolutely can, and it's a $1 billion value. And so there's a kind of intellectual dishonesty that's taking place here in a transfer of skill to without a transfer of wealth.
Yeah.
And that really bothers me.
Yeah.
So that's a different argument. You can come to my office and we can talk about that. I bet you're pretty sympathetic.
Awesome.
Yeah,